There's a state in America where the government owes $44,500 per taxpayer in hidden bills, and the official state budget calls itself balanced. That's not creative accounting. That's institutional fraud with bipartisan signatures. And it's not just one state. Across America, state governments have quietly accumulated a $765 billion shortfall, and most residents have no idea their state can't pay its own bills. Pension promises that aren't funded, retiree healthcare obligations that nobody set money aside for, bonds that get rolled over instead of paid down, federal COVID money that masked the rot for 4 years and is now drying up. In this countdown, we're exposing the 10 states quietly going bankrupt in 2026. Not the dramatic Hollywood version with sirens and stock market crashes. The slow version. The version where every June 30 the state closes the fiscal year, claims a balanced budget, and quietly pushes another $8 billion onto your kids. According to Truth in Accounting's 2025 Financial State of the States report, 25 states ended fiscal year 2024 without enough money to pay their bills. The worst of them got F grades. Some of them are running 50 to 60% funded pension systems. One state on this list owes $49,500 per taxpayer in unfunded pension liabilities alone. Another has set aside less than 15 cents for every dollar promised in retiree health care. A third just got downgraded by Moody's and is holding the bond market together with optimistic accounting assumptions. Think about it. You probably live in one of these states. You probably trust the words balanced budget without reading the footnotes. You probably don't know that the rainy day fund your governor brags about isn't even close to covering the unfunded promises. Subscribe before your state's bond rating gets cut again. Like the video if you've ever wondered why your tax fees keep going up while your roads get worse. You're about to find out. Let's break it down. Number 10. Ohio, where the rust never sleeps, and neither do the unfunded promises. There's a state where the public pension system has been quietly underfunded for decades, and the legislature keeps celebrating balanced budgets that aren't. Welcome to Ohio. Ohio sells itself as the dependable Midwestern state. Lower cost of living than the coasts. Manufacturing legacy. 3 reasonably well-run cities in Cleveland, Columbus, and Cincinnati. Decent universities. And a fiscal reputation that lives on a 1980s memory. Then you read the financial reports. The numbers. Ohio earned a D grade in Truth in Accounting's 2025 Financial State of the States report. The state ranks among the bottom half of states for taxpayer burden, with billions in unfunded pension and retiree healthcare liabilities. The Ohio Public Employees Retirement System, OPERS, has reduced retiree healthcare benefits multiple times since 2012 because the system's healthcare fund could not sustain its promises. The state teachers' retirement system of Ohio has been embroiled in governance disputes over investment performance and unfunded liabilities for years. Ohio's tax structure has been incrementally cut at the top brackets, narrowing the revenue base while pension obligations have grown, and the federal COVID aid that propped up Ohio's fiscal picture in 2021 to 2023 is now winding down. Reddit quote, Ohio's pension system has been one bad market year away from a crisis for 15 years. What it's like. Living in Ohio's fiscal future is like dating someone who insists they're financially responsible while the credit card bills sit unopened on the kitchen table. Picture this. You're 38, you work for the state, you've been paying into OPERS for 16 years. You read the annual report. Healthcare benefits are no longer guaranteed. The pension fund is funded around 80% on optimistic assumptions, which means probably less if the next decade looks like the last one. And the legislature is debating whether to cut your future COLA. Again. Where it gets uncomfortable, Ohio's leadership has used a familiar playbook for 30 years. Cut the top tax bracket, underfund the pension contribution, promise the markets will catch up. The markets sometimes do. The unfunded liability rarely shrinks. Sharp contrast. Ohio and Indiana are neighboring Rust Belt states with similar economic profiles. Indiana ranks well above Ohio in TIA's report, with much smaller unfunded liabilities, because Indiana actually funded its pension obligations. Same Midwest, different math. Ohio isn't failing dramatically. It's failing structurally. The way a house fails when nobody fixes the foundation, even though the paint still looks fresh. Number 9. Washington, where the no-income tax brand met the pension bill and the pension bill won quietly. There's a state where the surface-level fiscal pitch sounds great: no income tax, tech-driven economy, and the underlying pension and healthcare obligations are dragging it into sinkhole territory. Welcome to Washington. Washington is the state that confuses people. The brand is Seattle, Microsoft, Amazon, Boeing, Starbucks. The image is wealthy, progressive, modern, fiscally functional. And then Truth in Accounting puts Washington in the sinkhole states bucket, and people refuse to believe it. The numbers. Washington landed in the bottom 25 in TIA's 2025 report with a D grade. The state has substantial unfunded pension liabilities tied to its multiple state retirement plans. Washington recently introduced a 9.9% capital gains tax in addition to its property tax structure, and increased its top estate tax rate from 20 to 35%, the highest in the nation. Sales taxes in Washington are among the highest in the country, with a base rate of 6.5% and combined state-local rates above 9% in many cities. And while the state has avoided a personal income tax, it has aggressively expanded other revenue sources to keep up with obligations. Reddit quote, "We don't have an income tax. We just have everything else." What it's like. Living in Washington fiscally is like dating someone who keeps insisting they don't drink, while quietly emptying the wine cabinet. Picture this. You move to Seattle for a tech job. You're told there's no state income tax. You buy a $900,000 condo. Then you discover sales tax is 10.25%. Property tax bites harder than expected. You sell company stock and get hit with the new 9.9% capital gains tax. You die, and your heirs face a 35% estate tax above $3 million. The no-income tax brand starts looking like a pricing trick. Where it gets uncomfortable, Washington's revenue strategy has been to invent new tax categories rather than reform the old structure. The state's pension obligations remain underfunded, and the leadership has chosen to address the gap by stacking new taxes on capital gains, estates, and BO receipts, rather than restructuring liabilities. Sharp contrast. Washington and Wyoming are both no-income tax states. Wyoming has a $27,200 taxpayer surplus. Washington has a taxpayer burden. Different revenue sources, very different fiscal discipline. Washington isn't failing because the tech sector is weakening. It's failing because the state spent the boom years adding obligations faster than it added discipline, and the bill is now arriving in pieces. Number 8. Michigan. Where the auto industry left, the pensions stayed, and the math kept compounding. There's a state where the official message is, "We're recovering." And the underlying obligation is roughly $4,100 in hidden debt per taxpayer. Welcome to Michigan. Michigan's story is well known. Detroit's bankruptcy in 2013, the largest municipal bankruptcy in U.S. history, EPAL bankruptcy in U.S. history, the pension obligations that triggered it, the retiree health care promises that turned out to be unfunded, the decades of optimistic accounting that finally crashed into reality. Then the state recovered, sort of. The numbers. Michigan ranked 32nd in TIA's 2025 report, with a C grade and a $4,100 per taxpayer burden. Michigan had $44.2 billion in available assets to pay $58.3 billion in bills, leaving a structural gap. Detroit's emergence from bankruptcy in 2014 reduced one set of obligations, but did not eliminate the broader Michigan public sector pension and retiree healthcare gaps. Several Michigan municipalities, including Flint, have continued to face fiscal stress and emergency management interventions over the past decade, and the state's auto industry is now navigating EV transition, AI-driven layoffs, and uncertain job growth. Reddit quote, "Michigan technically improved. Most of the improvement came from federal COVID money that's now gone. What it's like. Living in Michigan fiscally is like dating someone who survived bankruptcy 10 years ago and still hasn't really learned to budget. Picture this. You retire from a teaching career in Lansing. Your pension is still paying. Your retiree healthcare keeps changing. Your premiums have climbed quietly every year. You read the news that the state has improved its financial position, and you wonder why your out-of-pocket costs keep climbing. The improvement is on paper. The improvement isn't in your prescription copay. Where it gets uncomfortable, Michigan's recovery from the 2008 to 2014 fiscal crisis was real but partial. The state government corrected some of its worst practices, but the structural underfunding of the public sector retirement system has not been fully solved. The post-COVID federal money temporarily masked ongoing pressure. Sharp contrast. Michigan and Wisconsin share a Great Lakes border and similar industrial legacies. Wisconsin has a taxpayer surplus and ranks among the better-managed states fiscally. Michigan still ranks in sinkhole territory. Different decisions, different decades, different outcomes. Michigan isn't failing dramatically. It's failing the way a person who survived a heart attack fails when they slowly slip back into the same habits. Number 7. New Mexico, where the pension fund has been one bad market year away from crisis for 15 years. There's a state where one of the major public sector retirement plans has a funded ratio of 33%, and the state government keeps insisting the fix is on the way. Welcome to New Mexico. New Mexico ranked in the bottom half of TIA's 2025 report, with a D grade. The state's combined unfunded retirement liabilities exceed $18 billion across PARA, ERB, and the Retiree Healthcare Authority. The Retiree Healthcare Authority specifically has had a funded ratio around 33%, which is fiscally catastrophic, and the unfunded liability translates to roughly $14,700 per member. The Educational Retirement Board, ERB, was at a 67.8% funded ratio in 2025, with full funding projected 19 years into the future, assuming favorable market returns. PARA, the Public Employees Retirement Association, has had to implement a shared sacrifice of higher contributions and a flexible COLA tied to plan health. Moody's downgraded New Mexico's bond rating in part because of pension liabilities. Reddit quote, "We've been told the pension fund will be fine for 15 years. The math hasn't been fine for any of those 15 years. What it's like. Living in New Mexico's fiscal future is like dating someone who's been promising to get their finances together since 2011 and is still on the same payment plan. Picture this. You're a New Mexico public school teacher. You've taught for 22 years. You're 47. You read the actuarial report. The plan is supposed to be fully funded by 2043, when you'll be 64. The plan's chances of reaching that goal hover around 47% on optimistic projections. You do the math. You start a personal Roth IRA. You stop trusting the state pension as your sole retirement. Where it gets uncomfortable, New Mexico's economy is heavily dependent on federal jobs, oil and gas revenues, and tourism, all of which are volatile. The state government has tried reforms, including PARA's flexible COLA mechanism, but the underlying pension underfunding has been multi-generational. Sharp contrast. New Mexico and Wyoming are neighboring resource state economies. Wyoming has built sovereign wealth-style reserves and runs a $27,200 taxpayer surplus. New Mexico has not built equivalent reserves and runs a substantial taxpayer burden. Same oil revenues, very different stewardship. New Mexico isn't failing because oil markets fluctuate. It's failing because the state never built the cushion that resource-rich states need, and the pension promises kept compounding while the cushion didn't. Number 6. Pennsylvania, where the keystone in the Keystone State turned out to be a pension liability nobody fully measured. There's a state where the public school pension system, PSERs, has been embroiled in scandal, FBI investigations, and chronic underfunding for years, while the legislature debates everything else. Welcome to Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is the state that should be bigger news than it is. 6th largest population. Major industrial legacy, 2 of the country's most important metro areas in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, and underneath, 2 pension funds that have been quietly absorbing scandal and structural underfunding for over a decade. The numbers. Pennsylvania ranked 40th in TIA's 2025 report with a D grade and a taxpayer burden of approximately $11,500. PSERs, the Pennsylvania Public School Employees Retirement System, has been the subject of an FBI investigation related to investment performance reporting, with federal subpoenas issued and senior staff departures. SERS, the State Employees Retirement System, has had its own underfunding challenges. Pennsylvania's corporate tax rate, while declining from a once 9.99% rate, remains above many neighboring states and impacts the state's fiscal flexibility. The state recently reduced the corporate income tax from 8.49 to 7.99% in 2025, with further cuts scheduled. But the unfunded pension liabilities continue to drive the underlying fiscal pressure. Reddit quote, PSERS has been a slow-motion ethics disaster. PA taxpayers will pay for it for the next 30 years. What it's like. Living in Pennsylvania's fiscal reality is like dating someone whose entire family has been on a Netflix true crime documentary and they still won't acknowledge it. Picture this. You're a public school teacher in suburban Philadelphia. You've been contributing to PSERS for 25 years. You read the headlines about the FBI investigation, the misreported investment returns, the senior leadership departures. You ask your union rep what it means for your retirement. The answer is some version of, the system is solvent. You don't quite believe the answer. You start saving privately, just in case. Where it gets uncomfortable, Pennsylvania has had a divided government for most of the past decade, with reforms repeatedly stalling between the legislature and the governor's office. The state has made incremental tax adjustments, but has not fundamentally restructured its pension obligations. Sharp contrast. Pennsylvania and Indiana are both Midwestern-adjacent states with industrial legacies. Indiana has a taxpayer surplus. Pennsylvania has a substantial taxpayer burden. The difference is Indiana's pension reforms in the 1990s and 2000s. Pennsylvania kept kicking the can. Pennsylvania isn't failing because Pittsburgh and Philly have problems. It's failing because the state's pension scandal got worse, the unfunded liability kept growing, and nobody in Harrisburg has been willing to truly fix it. Hey, before we get into the bottom five, the states we're about to cover are the ones whose fiscal positions are so structurally bad that truth in accounting gives them an F, the grade you got in chemistry when you stopped showing up. If this list has been useful, hit subscribe because the next one we're working on is 10 states where pensions are about to be cut, and you'll want the names. Like the video if you've ever read your state's annual financial report and felt your blood pressure rise. Drop a comment if your state made the list, or if you're a state employee watching your retirement promise slowly thin out. Real conversations happen in the comments, and I read them. Now let's keep going. Number 5. Maryland, where the federal government keeps the lights on and the state quietly forgets to pay its own bills.
There's a state where roughly 30% of the workforce is tied directly or indirectly to the federal government, and the state's own fiscal house has a $11,100 per taxpayer burden anyway.
Welcome to Maryland. Maryland is the state that benefits from federal proximity more than any other. The federal government and its contractor ecosystem prop up the entire D.C. suburb economy. Defense, intelligence, biomedical research, and federal contracting drive employment. And yet, despite this enormous structural advantage, Maryland still couldn't balance its actual books. The numbers.
Maryland ranked 41st in TIA's 2025 report, with a D grade and an $11,100 per taxpayer burden.
The state has substantial unfunded pension and retiree health care obligations through the Maryland State Retirement and Pension System. Maryland's reliance on federal employment makes it especially vulnerable to federal workforce reductions, and recent federal hiring freezes and DOGE-driven reductions have created acute revenue uncertainty. Maryland's top marginal income tax rate sits among the highest in the country, with combined state-local rates exceeding 9% in some counties. And the state has issued substantial general obligation debt for transportation and infrastructure that adds to the long-term obligations. Reddit quote, Maryland's economy is half federal. When the federal cuts come, the state's books are going to look very different. What it's like. Living in Maryland fiscally is like dating someone who has a great trust fund relative and pretends the trust fund is their own income. Picture this. You work for a federal contractor in Bethesda. Your job depends on continuous federal contracts. The state taxes you at 8.75% at the top bracket. You read the news that the federal hiring freeze is expanding, that contractors are being asked to scale back, that D.C. area home values are softening. You realize Maryland's fiscal health is structurally tied to a workforce that just got 3 to 5% smaller, and you wonder if your tax bill is about to get bigger to make up the difference. Where it gets uncomfortable, Maryland's leadership has spent decades building a budget around continuous federal expansion. That assumption is now being tested in real time. The state's pension obligations remain underfunded, and the loss of federal workforce stability narrows Maryland's revenue base just as obligations keep maturing. Sharp contrast. Maryland and Virginia both rely on federal employment heavily. Virginia ranks 12th in TIA with a taxpayer surplus. Maryland ranks 41st with a substantial burden. Different fiscal management for the same federal proximity. Maryland isn't failing because the federal government is shrinking. It's failing because Maryland built its budget on the assumption that the federal government would never shrink, and the assumption stopped being true. Number 4. Rhode Island, the smallest state with one of the slowest fiscal recoveries in America. There's a state where the population is roughly 1.1 million, and the unfunded retirement obligations still translate to thousands of dollars per taxpayer in structural debt. Welcome to Rhode Island. Rhode Island has been a sinkhole state on TIA's list for over a decade. And what's striking is that Rhode Island has actually attempted serious pension reform. In 2011, the state passed one of the most aggressive pension reform packages in the country under then-Treasurer Gina Raimondo. The reforms cut benefits, raised retirement ages, and restructured cost of living adjustments. And yet, Rhode Island still can't balance its books. The numbers. Rhode Island ranked 37th in TIA's 2025 report with a D grade. The state's combined unfunded pension and retiree healthcare obligations remain substantial despite reform attempts. Rhode Island's small population means even modest unfunded liabilities translate into outsized per-taxpayer burdens. The state has one of the highest property tax burdens per capita in the nation, and the state's major cities including Providence, Pawtucket, and Central Falls have all faced fiscal distress in the past 15 years, with Central Falls actually filing municipal bankruptcy in 2011. Reddit quote, "Rhode Island reformed pensions a decade ago and still can't catch up. The math was that bad. What it's like. Living in Rhode Island fiscally is like dating someone who's been in 4 different self-improvement programs and is still in the same place. The effort is real. The improvement is real. The starting point was just that bad. Picture this. You're a Providence police officer who retired in 2008. Your pension was supposed to include guaranteed COLAs. After the 2011 reform, those COLAs are now suspended until the plan reaches 80% funding. The plan is currently far below that target. You're 73. You're still waiting. You're going to keep waiting. Where it gets uncomfortable, Rhode Island's small population is its biggest fiscal vulnerability. A state of 1.1 million can't easily grow out of structural obligations the way a state of 30 million can. The state's leadership has been fiscally serious for 15 years, and even that hasn't been enough to escape sinkhole status. Sharp contrast. Rhode Island and New Hampshire are both small northeast states. New Hampshire has a $1,500 taxpayer burden, near balanced. Rhode Island has a substantial burden. The difference is New Hampshire's smaller government footprint and the absence of major legacy pension obligations. Rhode Island isn't failing because the state is small. It's failing because the state is small and the obligations are big, and the math has been ugly since long before anyone in office today was elected. Number 3. South Carolina, where the southern hospitality stays warm and the pension fund stays cold. There's a state where the public retirement system has been chronically underfunded for over 20 years, and the state's leadership has chosen tax cuts and growth narratives over honest restructuring. Welcome to South Carolina. South Carolina is the southern Sun Belt state that's quietly carrying one of the worst-funded public pension systems in the country. The brand is sweet tea, beach access, low taxes, BMW manufacturing, and a growth story that everyone in finance keeps recommending. The reality underneath is a public retirement system that has been on the brink for 2 decades. The numbers. South Carolina ranked 35th in TIA's 2025 report with a D grade. The South Carolina retirement system, SCRS, has had a funded ratio that has hovered between 50 and 60% for over a decade, well below the 80% threshold considered fiscally healthy. The state's combined unfunded pension liabilities exceed $24 billion across SCRS and the police officers' retirement system. South Carolina's leadership reduced the top individual income tax rate from 6.2 to 6% effective July 2025, narrowing the revenue base further. The state's reliance on tourism and manufacturing for tax revenue creates structural volatility. Reddit quote, SCRS has been 50% funded my entire career. At some point, that's not a temporary problem. What it's like, living in South Carolina's fiscal future is like dating someone who's been making minimum payments on a maxed-out credit card for 20 years and calls it good financial management. Picture this. You're a state employee in Columbia. You've contributed to SCRS for 18 years. You read the actuarial report. The fund's assets cover roughly 55 cents on every dollar of promised benefits. The state's annual contribution covers current benefits slowly, but doesn't meaningfully reduce the unfunded liability. You retire and start receiving your monthly check. You quietly hope the math doesn't catch up before you do. Where it gets uncomfortable, South Carolina's leadership has chosen the Southern tax-cutting narrative over the structural reform narrative for 2 decades. The state benefits from population growth, which expands the contribution base, but the unfunded liability has continued to grow even faster. Sharp contrast. South Carolina and North Carolina are direct neighbors with similar growth profiles. North Carolina ranks 14th in TIA with a taxpayer surplus. South Carolina ranks 35th with a substantial burden. Different pension management, different outcomes. South Carolina isn't failing because growth is bad. It's failing because the growth is happening on top of obligations that nobody is honestly funding, and the gap keeps widening every fiscal year. Number 2, Delaware. The first state to file your retirement and the second worst funded state in TIA's 2025 grading system. There's a state where the per-taxpayer burden is $15,700, and the state's reputation as a banking and corporate haven hides a fiscal house that's structurally underwater. Welcome to Delaware. Delaware's brand is incorporation paperwork. Roughly 2/3 of Fortune 500 companies are incorporated in Delaware. The state's franchise tax revenue from corporate filings funds a substantial portion of state operations. Delaware also enjoys no sales tax and aggressive marketing as a tax-friendly state. And yet, when Truth in Accounting analyzed the books, Delaware came in 45th. The numbers. Delaware ranked 45th in TIA's 2025 report with an F grade and a $15,700 per taxpayer burden. The state's State Employees Pension Plan, SEPP, has had funded ratios below 80% and significant unfunded liabilities. Delaware's other post-employment benefits, OPB, primarily retiree healthcare, are severely underfunded with low funded ratios. The state has historically depended on franchise tax revenue, abandoned property revenue, and corporate fees, all of which are subject to legal challenges and economic volatility. The U.S. Supreme Court has ruled in past cases against Delaware's aggressive abandoned property revenue practices, narrowing that revenue stream. Reddit quote, Delaware's books look great until you realize half the revenue is corporate filing fees that could legally be taken away. What it's like. Living in Delaware fiscally is like dating someone whose entire personality is, I work at Goldman, and you eventually realize they've been a junior analyst for 9 years. Picture this. You retire from a Delaware state job. Your pension is paying. Your retiree healthcare premiums have been quietly climbing. You read that the state's franchise tax revenue is being challenged in court, that abandoned property revenue is being limited by federal rulings, and that the unfunded retiree healthcare liability is one of the worst in the nation. You realize your retirement security is structurally tied to corporate paperwork, which is structurally tied to whatever the next Supreme Court case decides. Where it gets uncomfortable, Delaware's revenue model is unusually narrow for a state. The combination of franchise taxes, corporate fees, and abandoned property revenue makes the state vulnerable to legal and policy changes that other states don't face. Meanwhile, retirement obligations keep maturing on a normal pension calendar. Sharp contrast. Delaware and South Dakota are both small states that brand themselves as business-friendly tax havens. South Dakota has a substantial taxpayer surplus and ranks among the top 5 fiscally healthy states. Delaware has the second worst F grade. Different governance, very different outcomes. Delaware isn't failing because corporations are leaving. It's failing because the state's revenue model is fragile, the obligations are real, and the gap between the brand and the books has been widening for 20 years. Number 1. Connecticut. The state that built the Gilded Age, kept the Gilded Age accounting, and is paying for both. There's a state where every taxpayer would have to write a check for $44,500 to clear the state's outstanding bills, where the state has set aside less than 60 cents for every dollar owed in pensions and less than 15 cents for every dollar promised in retiree health care. Welcome to Connecticut. Connecticut has been a sinkhole state for over 15 years, not occasionally, not after a recession. Continuously, year after year, in TIA's data and in independent analyses, the state earned an F grade in 2025, ranked 49th out of 50, virtually tied with New Jersey at the very bottom. The numbers. Connecticut ranked 49th in TIA's 2025 financial state of the states with a $44,500 per taxpayer burden and an F grade. The state's combined shortfall sits around $61.8 billion. Connecticut has set aside less than 60 cents for every dollar promised in pensions and less than 15 cents for every dollar promised in retiree health care benefits. The state's two pension funds, SERS and TRS, have unfunded liabilities of approximately $49.8 billion combined. Connecticut's $4.1 billion rainy day fund, frequently celebrated by state officials, would cover only a fraction of the structural shortfall. The state's fiscal guardrails enacted in 2017 have been the only mechanism keeping additional debt from accumulating, and they remain politically contested. Reddit quote, "Connecticut's pension hole is so big, the state can't grow out of it. The hole is the state's main financial story now." What it's like. Living in Connecticut fiscally is like dating someone who graduated from Yale, makes $200,000 a year, and is somehow always 30 days from being broke. The income is real. The lifestyle is unsustainable. The bills don't care about the credentials. Picture this. You're a Connecticut state employee planning to retire in 5 years. You're 60. Your pension is supposed to include retiree health care for life. You read the state's annual financial report. The retiree healthcare fund has 14 cents for every dollar promised. You realize the math doesn't work. You start asking colleagues if they've heard anything about benefit reductions for current retirees. Nobody has heard anything official. Everybody has heard rumors. You stop trusting the silence. Where it gets uncomfortable, Connecticut's fiscal crisis isn't a recent failure. It's the result of 3 decades of pension underfunding, accounting maneuvers, and political reluctance to confront the math. The 2017 fiscal guardrails forced budget discipline for the first time, but they only stopped the bleeding. They didn't begin to close the existing wound. Federal COVID money temporarily masked the underlying pressure. That money is now mostly gone. Sharp contrast. Connecticut and New Hampshire are both small New England states with similar populations. New Hampshire ranks near balanced, with a taxpayer burden around $1,500. Connecticut ranks 49th. With a $44,500 burden. The difference is decades of pension funding discipline in New Hampshire and decades of pension underfunding in Connecticut. Connecticut isn't failing because of any recent crisis. It's failing because the state spent 30 years promising benefits it didn't fund, celebrating budgets that weren't balanced, and trusting markets to bail out math that markets cannot fix. So there it is, 10 states quietly going bankrupt on the official record, in plain English, in reports that almost nobody outside accounting circles ever reads. States where the official budget is balanced and the actual books are not. States where the rainy day fund gets celebrated and the pension hole gets ignored. States where federal COVID money masked structural rot for 4 years and is now drying up. States where the bond market keeps offering reasonable rates because it assumes the federal government will eventually backstop somebody. The states topping the fiscal health charts in 2026, North Dakota, Alaska, Wyoming, Utah, Tennessee, are not winning because they're lucky. They're winning because they funded what they promised. They built reserves before they cut taxes. They closed defined benefit plans to new employees before the math broke. And in the case of Tennessee, they made extra pension contributions for years until the unfunded liability got cut in half. The 10 states on this list took the opposite approach. Promise now, pay later. Push the bill on to the next governor, the next legislature, the next generation, until the next governor turns into the current governor, and the next generation turns into your kids, and the bill that nobody wanted to pay arrives in the form of higher taxes, slower services, cut benefits, and credit downgrades. The good news, you can know this. The information is public. The Truth in Accounting report is free. Your state's annual financial report is free. You can read them. Most people don't. Most people trust the words balanced budget and stop reading. The reason these states are silently going bankrupt is because the bankruptcy is silent. And it's silent because almost nobody is watching. If this list helped, share it with a friend who keeps trusting the official numbers. Hit subscribe because next we're breaking down 10 states where pensions are about to be cut, and you'll want to see if your retirement is on it. Drop a comment if you're a state employee, retiree, or taxpayer in one of these states. And remember, the worst fiscal crisis isn't the loud one. It's the one that gets called balanced until the day it isn't.